Hello everyone, welcome. This is Ethics and my name is Mark Thorsby. In this video we're going to be concluding our discussion on Kant's lecture on ethics. Hopefully you've been watching the previous videos. Just to give you a sense of it, this is the book we're using, which is translated by Lewis Infield, published by Hackett, though believe there's also a Cambridge Scholar edition, which is probably a little bit more thorough in terms of the translation and so forth, but that's what we've been reading, and that's what all my pagination refers to. So anyway, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. In the previous videos, we've really looked at theoretical concerns. What we're going to be looking at today is Kant's discussion of what our duties towards others are, and also the discussion of friendship, enmity, and our duties that are dictated by justice. So let me begin here with the notion of ethics as being the practical task of action. And for Kant, ethics is ultimately a practical philosophy. And you'll recall from our previous video here, Kant articulated two different reasons for action that compel us. On the one hand, we have grounds of compulsion, which are the legal reasons for how we act in certain sort of ways. So there are certain sorts of legal duties we have, duties of justice, in terms of our respecting the rights of others, that ultimately compel us to act in certain sorts of ways. This is compulsion. Now, for Kant, if you recall, simply fulfilling our legal duty is obviously a good thing. It's a moral requirement, but it is not morally meritorious, right? There's nothing that goes above and beyond, if you will, in terms of our moral activity if all we do is just live by legal standards. But that is one of the reasons we act. The other possible reasons we act ethically is in terms of the intrinsic goodness of an action. And for Kant, he specifically aligns this with his discussion of ethics. Now, one of the quotations I have here from Kant, I guess I can't zoom in, is that ethics, quote, is not a science which excludes coercive laws and coerced actions. It includes them, but examines them from the point of view not of compulsion, but of this inner quality. So that means that ethics is a philosophy of our dispositions. And as dispositions are the cardinal principles of an action, ethics is therefore a practical philosophy. So you can see here is that if you were to do a Venn diagram, you might say that ethics is a larger circle than simply than simply the circle of the law. So this is a very important discussion, and we actually looked at this quite a bit last time. Now, one of the things I want to pull from here, especially since if you've been watching the video series this semester, you know that we also did a very thorough analysis of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And here, I do want to mention a little bit, at least to help us begin to juxtapose Kant's moral philosophy from Aristotle's virtue philosophy here. By sort of remarking on some of the things that Kant says regarding ethics and virtue. He says, quote, ethics is sometimes described as the theory of virtue, and to be virtuous, man must, to be sure, respect the law and be punctilious in his observance of human rights, but virtue goes beyond this, to the disposition from which the action arises. So you can see here is that if ethics is a practical philosophy because it concerns our dispositions, obviously virtue is an incredibly important part of that, because virtue is not simply acting in accordance with the law, but it's about the disposition for how we ought to act here, right? And here I think we have to be a bit careful, because Aristotle's conception of virtue, the way we looked at it, was in terms of human excellence. Here, I think that Kant has a slightly more moralistic or even religious sense of what he means by virtue. He goes on, quote, the idea of virtue hardly suffices to express the nature of moral goodness. Virtue signifies strength and self-control and self-mastery in respect of the moral disposition, but a science of social ethics is not yet a theory of virtue, and virtue in turn is not yet morality. So his notion here is that virtue is an important ingredient potentially for articulating a science for how we ought to act and what our dispositions are. But because virtue is ultimately about the individual and the way the individual masters and controls themselves in the course of their daily life and in the course of their actions, you can see what this means is that ultimately, it's not sufficient for thinking about ethics in the broadest possible sense in terms of social ethics. Remember, for Kant, ethics and morality ultimately has to do with the universal attributes for how action ought to be arbitrated, which means that virtue isn't sufficient, right, for morality. Let's see here. Hold on, my computer seems to be freezing up. Let's see, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, let's go back here. I apologize. My computer seems to be freezing up a little bit. So this brings us to the question of what our duties towards others are, which is a specific section in the text. And so if you're following along, definitely turn to that section and read it. Remember here that there are going to be different forms of duties we have. We have not only duties to ourselves, but we have duties towards other people. And that's what we're going to be focusing on here. Now, on the one hand, as we can say, is that all of our duties towards others are directed towards other rational human beings. This is an essential ingredient that Kant talks about, particularly in his metaphysics, in his groundwork to the metaphysics of morals. For him, our rational duty, our duties are, we only have moral duties towards other moral agents. What makes another person another moral agent is namely their capacity to recognize the categorical imperative in the universal moral law, which means that fundamentally our duties towards others are directed towards other peoples who have rationality. So morality depends ultimately on rationality, and so our duties towards others depends also upon the rationality that other human beings have. So for instance, Kant says that there are no moral duties between animals or inanimate objects. So I don't have a duty to the book, and I don't have a duty to my cat, a moral duty, strictly speaking. What I could say is that I do have other duties towards things only insofar as they reference ourselves or other beings who I do have moral duties towards. So for instance, Kant famously argues that even though we don't have moral duties towards animals, we do have indirect moral duties towards animals insofar as if we begin to inculcate and habitualize cruelty towards animals, this quickly filters down into a potential cruelty towards other rational agents. And the same thing might be said in terms of objects. Maybe if, like, for instance, if I'm borrowing someone else's book, right? It's not that I have a duty not to destroy the book. The duty isn't to the book itself, but I have a duty to the other person to respect their objects. So that means that our duties towards things are always with regard to either with reference to either ourselves or to others. Now, this means that when we talk about our duties towards others, we can articulate two main groups of duties. On the one hand, we can have duties of goodwill or benevolence towards others, or we can have a duty of indebtedness or of justice towards others. Now, Kant's going to always think about benevolence here with regard to this first principle. But the second way of looking at these groups of duties is where we might articulate the notion of righteousness or compulsory action. And you can see here Kant is articulating the domain of the duties towards others we have, which are based in the law, which require us to do and we're compelled to do ultimately. So you might say is that our moral duties towards others concern the benevolence we have towards other people, and our legal duties we have towards others, which are also moral in another sense, concern the sort of way in which we're indebted towards others, or to respect their rights, or there's a principle of justice at stake. So Kant continues on with this same dichotomy here between the law and morality. Now let's look at our duties of benevolence. First and foremost, benevolence is not an obligation to love other people. We do have love for other people, and that does seem to involve goodwill. What we want to say here is that the sort of love he's interested in here is love is the goodwill from a voluntary inclination. Love comes from the heart, but our moral duties here concern the obligations that arise out of the understanding. Now remember here the way in which Kant articulates the incredible importance here of saying that moral action is directed out of the understanding and it is a rational operation. So what this means is that it can be the case that when I have love for other people, right, that it conforms with my moral duty but I may not even understand that obligation. And so in that sense, the love from the heart might not technically be a moral love. So the understanding that recognizes that the understanding is what recognizes that we have moral obligations and that these moral obligations are universal to all people. And benevolence arises from the recognition, that the others are included within that universality. So let me read you this quote here from 192 to 193. Kant says, quote, "Every one of use, therefore, in enjoying the good things of life, must have regard to the happiness of others. They have an equal right and ought not to be deprived of it. Since God's providence is universal and may not be indifferent to the happiness of others. If, for instance, I were to find in the forest a table spread with all manner of dishes, I ought not to conclude that it's all for me. I may eat, but I should also remember to leave some for others to enjoy. I ought not to consume in its entirety any particular dish in the case someone else might also fancy it. Recognizing, therefore, that providence is universal, I'm placed under an obligation to restrict my own compulsion, and to bear in mind that nature's preparations are made for all of us. This is the source of the obligation of benevolence." So it's very interesting here is that Kant is clearly articulating the notion that God's providence is a central ingredient here, right? And what I want us to emphasize and what I want you to see here is the notion of universality. Because, um, because ultimately our moral duties are grounded in universality, and there are other peoples who are included in that universe, right? That means that my moral duties have to become compatible with other people. And so this example, it's sort of an odd thing, but if I'm walking through the forest and I find a banquet table, he says, I may eat, but I have to remember that it's not just for me. I have to also conserve my fancies, and I have to restrict my own compulsion so that I can allow other people to also enjoy it. So that means that the universality here is ultimately the source of my obligation of benevolence. Now, we can distinguish here the notion of benevolence from love versus benevolence from morality, right? And you can see Kant already has given us the beginning stages of this distinction. Now, benevolence from love is good, but it's not necessarily motivated by principle. Thus, it can easily be destroyed, right? So Kant gives this example as you can imagine some people have a benevolent disposition, and they naturally are cheerful and friendly and bear love towards other people. But if you just have benevolence from love, from this affectivity or from this emotion, then what can happen is that all it takes is one person or maybe a couple people to begin to cross you. You show them love and they don't return it, and eventually you'll just stop being benevolent towards other people, because if you get wronged enough times, you essentially will no longer be motivated out of love towards other people. So that means that benevolence from love, while it might be a good thing, is not the same thing as the sort of benevolence to morality that we need. And benevolence to morality needs to be more robust than this. So, and it is more robust on his view, because benevolence for morality begins with these moral principles that can be articulated through the categorical imperative and through our recognition of the universality of our actions towards others, right? And the universality of the duties we have towards others, I should say. Now, one of the things he wants to say is that benevolence maybe isn't something we initially have, right? So maybe we recognize we have obligations towards others, and he thinks that benevolence begins with this recognition, but it maybe isn't. It may take time for us to develop benevolence towards others. He thinks that benevolence can be inculcated throughout the recognition of our rational obligations. In other words, that when we recognize that we have obligations towards others which are grounded in reason, what happens is we can direct our actions, and over time, through habituality, we eventually inculcate a spirit of benevolence. And he says only then can we inculcate the inclination of benevolence. So to be inclined to be benevolent requires first the recognition of my rational obligations towards others. So the sort of benevolence for morality that Kant has in mind here is a benevolence that's rooted ultimately in the understanding. It's not simply an emotion or an inclination that's derived out of love, right? Now, this means that we have to look here now to the second form of duties we have towards others, and these are the duties of indebtedness or of justice. Pardon me. Now, there's no question of inclination here because ultimately, justice doesn't care about what you're inclined to do or not, right? The duties of justice are compulsory, not compulsory, but compulsory, right? So, in other words, we're required to recognize the rights of others, and when we recognize those rights of others, this is where justice begins. Kant says, quote, "It's not a question of whether my neighbor is needy, wretchedly poor, or the reverse. If his right is concerned, it must be satisfied. This group of duties is grounded in the general rule of right." Now here, remember the earlier video or discussion we had on the distinction between morality and law here, right? And all of this should make sense to you, right? So the duties of justice, number one, concern the respect for the rights of others. So that means that other individuals have rights, and we are required to respect those rights, right, and conform to those rights. So here, when he talks about the rights of others and the respect for the rights of others, this is where injustice is the most fertile source of human misery. That is, when other people are unjust towards each other, when other people don't recognize and respect the rights of each other, this creates great human misery. For him, the injustice is a cause for more misery and human suffering than simply bad fortune or bad luck, right? So this is really a sort of important thing for him. The rights of others, he even argues, are sacred. They're something that are sacred that we have to always respect. They're not something that we can just choose to respect when we want to respect. We have to always respect the rights of others, right? At one point, Kant gives the example of a poor person and a rich person. It's very easy to want to respect the rights of a poor person because the poor person is already in a negative disposition socially. But his argument here is, guess what? The rights of the wealthy person, the rights of the person in position of power, count equally, right? So they're equally sacred. So the inclination to be benevolent, he says, is implanted by providence, by God, because of the weakness of human understanding. Now it's very interesting here because his discussion of God here is slightly, I think, in tension with his other works on God and his other works on morality. But you have to remember here is that when Kant is writing the lectures on ethics, he's using the Baumgarten textbook, which discusses divine providence. And so he's linking that discussion into his own analysis. And remember, part of the motivation for Kant's entire philosophy is actually about his defense of the notion, the rationality of having God play a role in our philosophical justification. So it's not a surprise. Now, we should recognize here that you can also have an accidental respect of rights. So what about the person who respects the rights of others, but they just do so by accident? Not because they're inclined to actually recognize that they have an obligation, they just happen by chance to respect the rights of others. So in other words, respecting the rights of others as a sort of charity kind of works, but the rights of others are something that demands respect. There's a duty to be held there. So in other words, the rights of others reveal a sort of indebtedness. Now here, the notion is not that we're indebted to the other, but that rather we're indebted to the universal moral law under which the other falls. Or at least that's how I understand Kant here. So which means that being charitable to others, while it's a good thing, is not the mainspring and the sole motive of our conduct. Otherwise, the world becomes a sort of theater, not of reason, but of inclination. And for Kant, the moral requirement here is one grounded in reason, not simply in my will or my whim or my wish to be nice towards others. And here, we're not going to talk about, he doesn't talk about it in the lecture on ethics, but there is an important distinction Kant makes between our perfect duties and our necessary duties here, which is related. So take a look at that in your research if you're interested in this topic. Now, over time, what happens is that duties develop into our motives to be kind and charitable towards others. That is, over time, our duties develop the motive of a sort of generosity. He says, quote, if we do good from duty, it becomes a habit, and we ultimately do it from love and inclination. And so this is the way in which ultimately Kant links up the notion that our moral duty isn't to love the other person, but we recognize that when we do love the other person, we fall in conformity to that moral duty. And that's because when we recognize our obligation, over time we build up habits, and those habits in turn motivate love. Right? Now, there are two kinds of love that Kant will articulate here. Number one is we have the love of the goodwill, right? And he defines this as the wish and the inclination to promote the happiness of other human beings or other rational agents, right? So here you have love. This is motivated out of goodwill. We want other people to have happy lives, and so we love them accordingly. Now, on the other hand, you can also have love of good pleasure. So in other words, we also as human beings not only have love that springs from the goodwill, we also have love of things which are pleasureful. And here Kant distinguishes the notion of you have love of sensual pleasure, the love of the senses, and that can take many forms. Kant actually gives the example of sex, right, which is the one that most philosophers will go to here. Because even Aristotle, here notice that Aristotle also seems to distinguish between both intellectual and sensual pleasures as well. Now, the intellectual pleasures are something else, and Kant discusses the idea that it's very difficult to actually pin down a definition for the intellectual pleasures which are good. But he does make this distinction. So you have two types of love of goodwill and love of good pleasure. Now, one thing that is important here is that the morally goodwill is not the wish for the happiness of the other, but that the happiness should be that the other should be worthy of happiness. Now, this is actually an sort of important point here, right? It's not so much that we just want other people to be happy, but that we want other people to be worthy of the happiness we want them to enjoy. In other words, the moral goodwill is not simply a love of goodwill, but a moral love of goodwill is one in which we want the other person, we wish them to become moral agents themselves. So that means that the moral goodwill begets morality for others. So what follows from all this? Well, there's a couple consequences. Number one, we can say is that punishments need to respect the humanity of the criminal. So for instance, he says, quote, a miscreant should be punished, but his humanity ought not to be violated by base punishments. So you can see here for Kant, we have something of a theoretical explanation for why we should prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, right? Cruel punishments or unusual punishments are punishments which deny the humanity of the criminal. And we have a moral duty to respect the rights of other people, including the rights of criminals. So simply because a criminal has broken the moral law, that doesn't mean that we in turn can now break our own moral law and treat them as just animals. That would be morally wrong, right? The criminal is still a human being, and insofar as they're still a human being, I have a moral duty towards them. So that's an a very important point, I think, ultimately, especially one that's related to the law. Number two is we need to be humane in the way in which we deal with other human beings. But what does that mean? Well, to be humane on Kant's view is to have sympathy with the fate of other people. And to be inhumane is to harbor no such feelings of sympathy. So in other words, to be humane is to have sympathy for others in the plight that other people endure or may endure. To be inhumane is just to not care. So you can see here is that we have to respect the humanity of other people, and ultimately that respect means also having sympathy with the sort of fate that other people may befall in their dealings in the world. So this is two important points. Now, one thing he's mentioned, I want to raise this because here you're a student studying philosophy, and Kant actually raises, well, why do people study the humanities? Ultimately, the answer is we study the humanities in order to develop our own sympathy we have for others. In other words, to develop and refine a capacity for recognizing the humanity of others and developing a sympathy with others. So Kant gives this example. He says, thus, while a merchant will judge the worth of a man by his possessions, a student will employ another standard. So this is important. The reason we study the humanities and the reason we study other cultures is ultimately because it's a way of widening our own sympathy for others and thereby widening the sense in which we can engage in a respect for others, right? And so this is sort of a moral justification for having a well-rounded education, for instance, and not simply seeing things from the perspective of your own station in life, right? So you don't, if you're a business person, you don't just want to judge people according to the rational arguments related to business, your business endeavors, the enterprise of making money, right? You want to have a more holistic, diversified, complete sense of humanity, and so that's why you study the humanities, right? So we should all become students of culture for this reason, right? In his view. Now, how can we love the unlovable, which is an interesting case? He says, quote, in such a case, love cannot be inclination, but must be a wish that he had the worth in which he could find pleasure. The inclination to wish to find others lovable is one that we ought to possess. If we seek for it, we shall surely discover something lovable in them, just as an unlovable man finds in others, because he looks for them the qualities which make them unlovable. So here the question is, what about people who are just terrible? Think about criminals. Let's think about Hitler, for instance. Hitler seems to be a very good candidate for someone who's unlovable. And here Kant sort of seems to say as well, okay, love can't be an inclination potentially because we can't find anything in that person which is lovable, or what we find, there's nothing to love in them. And here Kant seems to suggest that, well, what we can do in this case is we can develop an inclination towards loving other people, and we have to do that by looking for something that actually is lovable. Just in the same way that the person who's unlovable only finds things which are unlovable in others. So you have to there's a sort of subjective trick here. But this sort of raises for me a question of, does that mean that I have a moral duty, therefore, to find something that is lovely about Hitler? In the sense, it seems to be what Kant is suggesting here, but I have a sort of inclination here to say that it seems to be something wrong with that. Now, on moral education, Kant adds this, quote, moral instruction must therefore be based on the view that our pleasure in seeing others happy should be synonymous with the pleasure it gives us to promote their happiness. It follows that the object of our pleasure is not actually the happiness of another in and for itself, but only insofar as we have helped to bring it about. So that means that the sort of pleasure we gain isn't gained through other people actually achieving their happiness, but it's achieved, the pleasure we gain from trying to instruct others morally is gained by recognizing that we actually have helped to bring morality about for others, a sort of moral disposition for others. Now, this swings us into the question of friendship, and actually, at the end of this section on our duties towards others, Kant begins to describe friendship. So let's jump into it. And recall here, just for sake of contrast, that Aristotle also describes friendship in terms of three different forms. Right? He had a friendship of utility, a friendship of eroticism, and also a complete form of friendship. And we're going to see some similarity and some differences with the way in which Kant handles friendship. Now let's begin this with the two motives to action. It seems on the one hand, that means you have two motives which seem to motivate friendship, right, or move us towards friendship. One is self-love. And our self-love, of course, is derived from ourselves. It's derived from the agent themselves. The second type of motive here towards friendship is the love of humanity, which is derived from the other, and it is a moral motive. Now, the problem, though, is that we have these two motives of action. So when I'm living my life, I want to do things which help me, right? But I also want to do things which help others. But these two motives can come into conflict, right? So what this means is that, for instance, maybe I have something that was good for my self-love, but it's bad for my love of humanity. How do I deal with this? And this is where friendship comes in, right? He says, quote, here friendship comes in, but how are we to proceed? Are we first from our self-love to secure our own happiness, and having done that, look to the happiness of our fellows, or should the happiness of others come first? So you can see how are we to make sense of this. And ultimately, what Kant's answer here is that friendship is about equality. It's about the equality we have with other human beings. Friendship is a reciprocity. It's a reciprocal relationship of love the two people have between each other. Quote, the happiness I give to another would be returned to me. There would be an exchange of welfare, and no one would suffer, for another would look after my happiness as well as I looked after his or her. So friendship for Kant is about reciprocal exchange. Now, here I have a question, my own personal critique is, that seems to be somewhat problematic because it seems to me that some of the best forms of friendship I have are really non-reciprocal in their highest motives. That is, when my friends help me out, it seems that they have a selfless motive. It's not simply about exchanging one thing for another. Now, but we can come back to that later, right? But here you can at least, Kant imagines what the reverse case would look like, right? Where everyone has self-love but remains indifferent to others. So what seems to follow from that is if I achieve my own interest and don't deny the interest of others, I'm not exactly in moral fault, but I do not have moral merit. So in other words, what it seems to suggest here is that if I'm only looking for my self-love and I only act out of that motive, and I don't actually injure other people's rights and things like this, then there's nothing morally wrong with it, but there's nothing morally right with it either, right? It's not meritorious morally. And recall here Kant made earlier the distinction between meritorious action as being pretty important, right? So what we see here is sort of what I would say is the golden rule rebounded, right? The golden rule famously is the idea that you have to love others as you would love yourself. Notice what Kant says, quote, the greatest love I can have for another is to love him as myself. So that is the golden rule. He goes on, I cannot love another more than I love myself, but if I'm to love him or her as I love myself, I must be sure that he or she will love me as I love them, or as they love themselves, I'm sorry. In which case, he restores to me that which I part, and I come back again to myself. This idea of friendship enables us to measure friendship and to see the extent to which it's defective. My apology for the little spelling error and the other spelling errors I've noticed throughout on the video here. But this is very interesting, right? Is what it means is that the golden rule, self-love, is the basis of my love for the other person, it would seem. And this enables me to measure friendships. And I can figure out where my friendships are defective and where they're not by determining the defection, I guess, of the way in which a friendship is not reciprocal, or there is no self-love, and they don't have a self-love for themselves, right? So self-love becomes an important case, and really, in a certain way, what Kant is doing here is he's articulating a way in which the golden rule can be consistent with his moral philosophy. This is actually something that other philosophers do. For instance, John Stuart Mill, in his book Utilitarianism, also has a discussion of the golden rule and tries to argue that the golden rule is really just a version of the greatest happiness principle. Now, there's more on that. We'll take a look at that in a future video. But it's quite interesting. I misspelled friendship again. My apologies. But it's interesting that Kant is going to now articulate 3 types of friendship. But these are not the same types of friendship we saw in Aristotle. But there is some similarity and some overlap, though they're not synonymous. Number 1 is you have what he calls a friendship of need or necessity. And he says this is the original form of friendship. In other words, I need something, you need something, we become friends out of necessity, out of need, right? The thing is, he says, though, is that when we gain luxury, when we gain enough sufficiency of means, this no longer becomes a possibility. It's no longer necessary to have friendship of need. So friendship of need, though, is, if you will, presupposed by all the other forms of friendship, and it enables confidence in the other forms of friendship that we have. Now, one thing he will say is that noble friends always avoid burdening each other. So if you have really good friends, you'll notice that you can always go to your friends with needs, so you have confidence that they'll be there when you need them. But a good friend doesn't always try to burden the other person with things that they need done, right? So for instance, recently, my house flooded and I had all these needs and I called upon my friends to help me. And I felt bad about doing that. And later on, I still had other needs, but I found myself not calling my friends, not because I didn't think that they would help me, but precisely because I thought that they would. And I didn't want to overburden them with my needs. So you can see here is that necessity and need forms maybe the basis or the original form of friendship, but it's certainly an atomic type of thing. And over time, the more we develop friendships, we have other forms of friendship. Now, for Kant, you also have a friendship of taste. Now, a friendship of taste for Kant is what he calls a pseudo friendship, and that's because it is no longer reciprocal. What does this mean? Well, a friendship of taste is a friendship that consists in the pleasure that we derive from each other. So, for instance, some people I love to hang out with and spend time with, not so much because we have a reciprocity between each other, a sort of exchange, if you will, but because precisely we actually just have a lot of fun together and we get pleasure from each other's company. But a friend of taste are not equal because I derive from the other person something that I don't have. And the other person gets something from me that they don't have. And this is what a friendship of taste is. And this form of friendship is based in the variety and the pleasure we can gain from other people. But ultimately, it's not the truest form of friendship, right? The truest form of friendship has to ultimately be grounded in a reciprocal relationship that we have with the others. Now, and this is what he's going to argue is a friendship of disposition or sentiment. This, for him, is the sort of friendship that we would talk about in the absolute sense of being friends. Because it's based in the disposition of others, it's based in the disposition that others have towards each other. He gives a quotation here, and I thought I'd just throw it in here from page 205. He says, quote, "In ordinary social intercourse and association, we do not enter completely into the social relationship. The greater part of our disposition is withheld, and there's no immediate outpouring of all of our feelings, our dispositions, and our judgments." Again, sorry, there's a misspelling there. But if we can free ourselves of this constraint, if we can unburden our heart to another, we achieve complete communion. These friends are few. So Kant's view here is that the friendship of disposition is where I can completely become transparent with myself towards another person. And I can lay out all of my dispositions, my judgments, my feelings, and I can find complete communion with another person. So how does making friends make things better for ourselves? Well, friendship, he says, quote, "is an aid in overcoming the constraint and the distrust that men feel, or men and women feel in their intercourse with others, by revealing himself to them without reserve. It is man's refuge in this world from his distrust of his fellows, in which he can reveal his disposition to another and enter in communion with him." So why is having friendship important? Because it becomes a refuge for ourselves in a world where we feel constrained and we don't feel that we can trust other people with being transparent with our true feelings, right? So what we see here is that friendship is not just about the equality of thought we have, but friends have to have compatible intellectual and moral principles. And it's interesting because Aristotle made a similar point in his discussion of friendship, where, if you recall, Aristotle argued that friends have to have compatible virtue. And when one friend loses virtue, then the friendship is lost. Kant is making a similar point here. It's not just that friends have similar opinions or they agree with the same thing, but it's that friends have compatible intellectual principles and they have compatible moral principles. Because if friends don't have compatible intellectual principles, they can't understand each other, and then they can't actually recognize each other's dispositions, and they can't be in communion in that sense of the complete friendship. But you have to also have these compatible moral principles for the same reasons that ultimately Aristotle articulates. Here's a quotation for you. "The uprightness of disposition, sincerity, trustworthiness, conduct devoid of all falsehood and spite, and a sweet, cheerful, and happy temper, these are the elements which make up the character of a perfect friend." So this is as close we get to Kant's articulation of what a perfect friend would look like. you can see is that a perfect friend has the characteristics which would enable us to bear our dispositions towards others, right? If you have a friend who's not cheerful, then you don't feel comfortable bearing your soul to the other person, because it's like, because you, well, at least I would feel the sense of, I don't want their negative disposition to be, projected onto my disposition. And so you can see here, a friend has to have the right disposition. They have to be trustworthy. They can't be false, but they also have to have a sort of happy temper in order to allow them to be the person towards whom I can commune with, right? And here you can think about the way in which your own friendships operate. And what you'll probably find is that you're in agreement here with Kant, right? Now, how do friendships end, right? Well, friendships end when friends are no longer transparent with each other, because that means that the reciprocal relationship that you have with your friends is no longer possible. So in other words, when the equality and the reciprocity between friends ends, so too will the friendship end. So consequently, not all persons can be friends with each other. He says, quote, I compare goodwill in my heart towards everyone, but to be the friend of everybody is impossible. For friendship is a particular relationship, and he who is a friend to everyone has no particular friend. So that means that we have moral duties towards others, and those moral duties, of course, filter down into our friends, but we don't have a moral duty to actually be friends with everyone. So don't get that confused as he discusses this. Now, Kant now talks briefly here about enmity. And enmity is just the opposite of friendship. It's not the same thing of just having a lack of friendship, because remember, Kant doesn't think that we have to be friends with everyone. So what then is enmity? Well, enmity has two characteristics. On the one hand, it's the mutual dislike between people and a mutual ill will between people. So interestingly enough, enmity has this characteristic of a reciprocity between people, but it's a negative reciprocity. You don't like each other, and you want something bad to happen for each of you, right? You bear ill will towards each other. He says, mutual liking and goodwill make friendship. Mutual dislike and ill will make enmity. So what is ill will? Well, ill will he defines as wishing harm upon another person, which, by the way, is immoral, right? So he's going to be against this, right? He's going to say that ultimately enmity, whereas friendship can be a moral form of relationship that we have with other people, enmity is an immoral form of a relationship we can have with others. Now, ill will is a disposition of being pleased when the other gets harmed, right? And morally, it's therefore wrong to have ill will towards others, because we shouldn't have morally pleasure when other people, right, are in harm's way or have some sort of burden that they're undergoing. So that means that we ought to cherish enmity towards none, right? So we don't have to be friends with everyone, but we shouldn't be enemies either, right? So this raises the question of peace. So how do we deal with people in terms of peace? He says a man is peaceable if he detests every kind of enmity, right? So that means a man is peaceable if they detest ill will towards others. And also, what do we say here? If they detest ill will and they detest the mutual dislike that people can have with each other, right? So that means there's two kinds of peace-loving people, or two kinds of actions of trying to enable peace in the world. One is wishing for your own peace, right, which is less noble than number two, striving to bring peace to other people, which is more noble. So it's interesting here. Notice how Kant is playing around with the distinction between self-love and love for others. It's always moral to have self-love, but it's not as good as having love for others, right? And the same thing follows with regard to peace. Now, what is misanthropy? Misanthropy is the hatred of men. And some people hate other people, and the question is why? And he says, Kant sort of, and I'm not convinced that Kant's right about this, but Kant seems to suggest two possible reasons for this. Number one is some people hate other people because they're shy. He calls it shyness, or in other words, they withdraw from the world and they're afraid of other people. And so in this sense, you can say is that Some hatred is rooted in the fear that people have towards each other. And think here about the type of racism that people can have. Some people are racist, but their racism is grounded in ignorance and fear, right? And so this is maybe a misanthropy of fear or shyness. The other possibility is people have hatred towards others because of enmity, right? They literally see all other people as their enemies, which is an immoral sort of dimension. Now, obviously, having misanthropy is going to be immoral, no matter what the sources are. So, okay, this brings us finally here to the questions of our duties that are dictated by justice. And remember here, we've talked about our duties towards others in a moral sense, but we do have duties towards others. Now, remember, our duties towards others in terms of justice are dictated by law, and they have to do with the rights that other people have. Now, rights are determined by the law, and law is compulsory, whereas ethics is not. So that means that the duties that are dictated by justice are not the highest duties, but they are the most necessary duties, you might say, right? So to comply with the demand of justice is not generosity, but a discharge of indebtedness, right? So that means that let's say if I buy something from another person and then I go to pay them, paying them is not the same thing as being generous, right? I'm actually discharging my indebtedness to the universal law as it's enshrined legally within the sort of legal framework. They have a right to be paid for what they sell. And in that sense, right, it's my duty to them is not simply one of generosity, but ultimately it's a discharge of indebtedness, right? So this will ultimately bring us to the idea that the duties of justice are more important, are the most important that we have towards others because they're the most necessary. And maybe I'm explaining this in a way that seems somewhat conflicting, right? What you can say is that the moral duties are the more perfect duties, I think. But the duties of justice are the most important we have towards others because they're the ones which we're compelled to do. So Kant says that compared to our duties of justice or the rights of others that we have to respect, generosity is superfluous, right? Generosity is just the secondary. It's the icing on the cake, but it's the cake. It's justice is the heart of our duties towards others, right? Maybe that's the way we could say it. But the duties we have towards others are higher than the duties of justice that we have towards others. I'm sorry, the duties we have to ourselves are higher than the duties of justice that we have towards others. So in other words, don't forget your duties to yourself. And here you can recall the way in which Kant rebounds or reinforces the notion of the golden rule, right? The love we have for others begins first with the recognition of our own self-love. So don't forget about yourself as you discharge your own duties, right? So this sort of concludes our sort of discussion of Kant's lecture on ethics for tonight. What we'll be looking at next time is we're going to begin Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, and we're going to see. I'm going to be recording videos for all of Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, which you can get freely available online. So take a look at that text and follow along with us, and you'll see that what I want to do is slowly contrast. We've looked at Aristotle, now we've looked at Kant's ethics. Next, we're going to look at Nietzsche, who's sort of the antithesis of either one of those two. And then finally, we'll look at Foucault, who's a sort of modern Nietzsche for the contemporary era. So that's where we're at so far in the ethics course, and I hope you're enjoying the videos. Okay, I'll see you guys online. Thanks a lot for watching. Talk to you later. Bye.